Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture Albion Never Dies. Today, I'm talking about the novel Lady Chatterley's Lover with the British novelist Roland Hulme. You can find him on Amazon, which describes him as a digital Don Draper with a Hemingway complex, one of the world's foremost experts on social media and interactive marketing. Indeed, he's a very easy man to find on social media, normally using the handle Roland Hulme, or on YouTube, where he has the username Roland Hulme. I had him on the podcast last October, so we are overdue another appearance. He's the author of the Knuckleheads Motorcylcle Club books, High Point, and also the Edventure Eddie series. But he got his start writing romantic fiction, so that's why he's here today to give me his unique take on Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, the classic book released partially in Florence in 1928, partially in Paris in 1929, both in English, then in England in an expurgated edition in 1932, but the full text was published only in 1959 in New York City, and then in 1960 in London, when it was the subject of a landmark obscenity trial that largely turned on the justification of the use in the book of, until then, taboo sexual terms. So today, I'm talking to a British novelist who has written romantic fiction about a classic romantic British novel. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Okay, Roland, thank you very, very much for joining me to talk about Lady Chatterley's Lover. For those like myself who have never read the book, can you lay out a thumbnail sketch of what is Lady Chatterley's Lover?
Well, it has been a very long time since I read it under the covers with a torch, because it was racy, or considered racy when I was young. But it's the story of a young aristocratic lady who is married to a husband who is impotent, and she starts having an affair with their gardener. And when it was published back in, I think it was 1929, it was considered so scandalous for all sorts of reasons. It ended up triggering an obscenity trial, and this was really where people started looking at, like, what is obscene literature? How do you view obscenity? And I think to a certain extent it paved the way to the broadening of people's attitudes towards sex in literature and stuff like that. But there are certain quotes, like a judge who said obscenity is, you know it when you see it. And it starts to make people realize that when you talk about what's obscene to some people might not be obscene to other people. Where do you draw the line between things? And I think what's so interesting about Lady Chatterley's Lover is people focused on, like, it's a book that has these torrid sex scenes. It uses swear words, four-letter words that aren't publicly acceptable. But to a certain extent, I believe the real controversy was, there was an aristocratic lady having it off with the working class gardener, which was deeply scandalous and shocking just because of the taboo nature of that.
And immediately you raise this thing of it was shocking at the time. I've often wondered, if I read this book, will I find it shocking today?
I don't believe you will. And it's funny, I started off in the writing business, writing saucy stories. And I used to, it was 2013 when the Amazon Kindle had just happened. And I used to write short saucy stories, because I used to do that for Hustler magazine and things like that. First ever check I got was for writing a saucy story. And there was a very popular niche of erotica called the cuckold thing. And this is where it's very popular incredibly popular among men for some reason. But it's about a husband whose wife sleeps with another man, and then he learns about it and he's witness to it, and he can't do anything to stop it, and he can't sleep with her, and she could only get satisfaction from this other lover, and it's a big sexual kink. And to a certain extent, the interesting thing about Lady Chatterley's Lover is that's what the story was. It was a saucy story about an impotent husband who learned his wife was having an affair, which is a taboo affair, with this working class gardener. And I find it, looking back through the lens of my own experience of, like, writing saucy stories, I'm like, this is just a cuckold erotica story that but it was, like, written by D.H. Lawrence, who was, quite a well-respected writer, and then it was released to the public in a way that saucy stories weren't traditionally done, and then it brought about this obscenity trial. and that really just paved the way to sort of mainstreaming sexually explicit content in fiction and literature.
But it is a well-written tale, if it's D.H. Lawrence.
Oh, it is D.H. Lawrence, absolutely. And I mean, it is a well-written tale. I think to a certain extent, because, we're almost a century after it's written, it's a little more archaic and a little slower. And what was considered obscene and explicit in those days is nothing compared to what you might read today. I mean, I write steamy romance novels, and they're quite sexually explicit. And even what I consider to be sexually explicit, and what other people might read my stuff and be like, this is a bit racy, is nothing compared to some of the other stuff that's published. And it's like steamy stuff has become quite mainstream. I think people like the taboo elements of it. And I think almost the allure of Lady Chatterley's Lover is that it's still taboo and it was obscene and it was a banned book.
And you mentioned the class element. You mentioned the class element a few times.
Yeah, I think that's really the thing that was so shocking, because I think as British people, we still cling to the class system to a certain extent. And I think we all decide where we fit. And I think when you meet somebody, we might have preconceptions about them based on what our viewpoint of their class is. But back in the 1920s, of course, that was so much more of a focus. And then to have like a genuine aristocrat and a genuine Northern gardener getting together, I mean, that was like gasp. That was like, I don't know, Downton Abbey even hasn't gone there.
Why did D.H. Lawrence go there? Do we know? Do we have any insight into what drove him to write this story?
I don't quite know what inspired him to do it, but he came from a fairly humble background. I think his father was a coal miner or something like that. His mother was a teacher in like a small school, and obviously he was born and brought up in Nottinghamshire. So, and you think 100 years ago, Nottinghamshire was very different to how it is today. I think right now, like, the north of England has all of these incredible companies there. I think it's one of the most rapidly developing parts of Britain in terms of like technology and innovation and stuff like that. Back then it was factories and farms. And it wasn't, I think there was much more prejudice against, people from the north compared to people from the south. And so again, it sort of dipped into that. It's like he was not just a working class gardener; he was a working class gardener from the north. It's like gasp, shock, horror.
It makes it far worse.
But I think maybe that's one of the things. D.H. Lawrence, he himself became a teacher, and then he ended up getting a teaching certificate from University College in Nottingham. So he had this weird upbringing where he had the absolute salt of the earth working class father, and then he was exposed to education and I don't know, what would you call it? I don't know, the more upper class of society. And I think maybe that's where he saw the opportunity for the story, is by like putting the two together. I felt to a certain extent he must have felt torn apart his whole life to have come from these two worlds and to be pursuing a career as a writer and a career as an academic. Yet, his father was a miner. And then maybe this was something, a kind of cathartic way to marry the two together.
That is interesting, comparing it to his parents. I wonder if it would have been received differently if it was, for example, an upper class man having an affair with a lower class lady.
Joe, that's a really interesting thought. I don't think it would have been. I think that happened an awful lot. I mean, I'm sure there were all sorts of lords and ladies who would be fooling around with their scullery maids. I think the shocking thing is, women are meant to be innocent and virginal and well behaved and things, and it's like an extramarital affair. Gasp. With a gardener, gasp, who's from the north, gasp. And that's a taboo element. But I think the taboo element is what makes it exciting and interesting and compelling for people. I think people like to flirt with things that are taboo. I wrote about.
Absolutely.
I mean, I mentioned earlier that this whole cuckold fetish thing that is really big in erotica and pornography and stuff these days. In America, it's very much a man and his beautiful wife, and they tend to be a white couple, and then she has an affair with an African American, because there's a taboo element there. America has still an understated kind of level of racism, and so that is still considered shocking and taboo today in American society. So that's why it's like part of it. And I think it's almost just a mirror of how Lady Chatterley's lover must have been received at the time there.
It's been said a few times that America has racism because they're not sophisticated enough yet to have a fully developed class system.
Well, I think it's very funny. I think America tries to pride itself as like, having moved past the whole racial thing, but it's difficult when you have an entire, you have 7 generations of people who were treated as property because of the color of their skin. You can't just fix that over the course of 50 or 60 years. So there are still all sorts of elements, unspoken elements of racism and the way people treat other people in America that we don't simply doesn't exist in England. I mean, obviously there is racism exists in Britain, but not to the same extent. I mean, in Britain, there were black doctors, whereas in America, slavery was still ongoing. So it's kind of like...
Yeah, we never had segregation. I mean, I always think we do have it, but it's a bit like the lady who goes up to the Queen and says, I have a diamond too. It's a different scale.
But I think it's the taboo element. But the taboo element is what is really exciting to people. I mean, I think that's the thing. My first bestseller that I wrote was a steamy novel called Sold to the Cartel, and it was about an American girl who went on a honeymoon went on a weekend to Mexico with her boyfriend, and her boyfriend sold her to this big cartel boss. And it's like that one flew off the shelves because people are like, gasp, cartel boss. And then you describe him as built like the Rock, and it's kind of, I think there are certain elements like that are exciting because they're saucy and shocking and controversial and taboo. I think what is the biggest one that people have a problem with Lady Chatterley's lover, though, is like she willingly became a participant in this affair. Whereas one of the unspoken rules of like classic erotica is that women, the female characters, these things tend to happen to them. Like, oh, you're this girl and you get sold to a drug cartel boss, and it's like, and then he pulls you into bed and makes love to you and you have 7 million orgasms, but it's not your fault because you were sold into it. And I think there's this whole thing of it's in erotica, it's like it's not the woman's fault that she gets subjected to this, which of course ends in true love and pleasure and stuff. All those bodice rippers, I don't know, my mother used to have lots of bodice rippers where it's the woman would be stolen by the pirate and he'd like tear her clothes off, and afterwards she'd be like, I've never known that that's for a man until this moment. And I think there was this whole viewpoint of women had things happen to them and therefore they couldn't be blamed for it, whereas with Lady Chatterley's lover, she was a willing participant in this affair, which again was another shocking element that people would have trouble with. I think even today certain audiences might have trouble with that because it's like, gasp, you're having an affair with your husband, that makes you a bad person.
So it's female led. She definitely sort of consented to the affair and continued the affair. More of a participant or active participant than usual then. I say I've never read it. So
I mean, she had her own what she called, I was going to say authority. She had her own motivation. She was willing to make her own decisions, and she acted as an autonomous creature, which is, I guess, back in the 1920s, it was very shocking to have stories written like that would be so sexually explicit and to delve into this taboo.
I'm wondering, because you talk about the shock element quite frequently. I'll read a passage of Ian Fleming, and you do occasionally read these funny little lines, and you think, did he write this for any other purpose than upsetting his wife and her friends?
Oh, there's that one line in Dr. No where he describes Honey Ryder as having the backside of a boy.
Yes.
And I remember Coward made fun of him, and everyone was like, I wonder what that implies. And I'm certain he was sitting there with his ridiculous cigarette holder, probably going, oh, I'm sure they'll love this part. They'll all clutch their pearls.
Do you think he's doing it deliberately to make people clutch their pearls? I always felt they got it worse as it went on. I wonder if he got some kind of pushback. I was like, I'm going to do it more.
One thing I realized writing romance novels is I used to sort of censor myself to a certain extent, and then I started reading other romance books by female authors, and they didn't hold back at all. You realize overkill is underrated. Sometimes you want to just go in and throw everything at it. Because when you read something like 50 Shades of Grey, it's like the sex is nothing. in 50 Shades of Grey. The parts that are interesting is, this very unhealthy relationship between this millionaire and this innocent girl and stuff. But you'll find far steamier things out there. And I think it's the same for Lady Chatterley's Lover. It's like, it's not necessarily the most explicit of books, but at the time there was nothing like it, and certainly nothing like it that was projected into the mainstream in the same way. And a lot of it was to do not necessarily with the sexually explicit scenes, but with the that taboo element of her having an affair with a working class person. And that's really what makes it steamy. There's a phrase in writing romance novels, that's a piece of advice someone gave me that's always stuck well, which is, it's not about the effing, if you know what I mean by effing, it's about the mind effing, as in, it's not about describing the sex, it's about describing the kind of like twisted circumstances that lead to the sex.
Which a friend of mine did, he did theatre, and when he was going through his theatre training and they had to kind of write their own scripts and so on, the man who ran it said, I'm going to have one rule, which is you're not allowed to be naked on stage. And they're all like, because you're stuffing. Is like, no, because you're lazy. And this is just a lazy way to shock people. The question is, do you have to do this to make a scene shocking? Or is there another way to make an impact, to make a shocking scene? Like, you have to work for it, basically.
I think that's great advice, and that's good storytelling as well. I was watching an episode of Star Trek, of all things, with my son the other day, and it was about these two characters who, in a transporter accident, got turned into one character, and then they find, after a couple of weeks, this character has actually created a life for himself, and then they're like, "Oh, we can split you apart again," and he's like, "But if you do that, you'll kill who I've become," and it's like, that's a moral question, and so. It's posing moral questions like that, and posing questions and making situations that make you think, that is really where the stuff that people find objectionable comes from. So I don't think it was the explicitness of Lady Chatterley's Lover that did that. I think it was her having an affair with the working class person. How shocking that was back in those days.
Which makes me wonder, because we've talked about the shocking element, but one thing is that I say I've never read this book, and yet I know the story. Like, it's gone into the mainstream that much. You mentioned 50 Shades of Grey. I have not. You'll love this. I've had bits of 50 Shades of Grey read to me in the voice of the Cookie Monster. Thanks to the internet,
I have to hear that.
Good friends, I've had the saucy bits read to me in the Cookie Monster's voice. So, like, something has taken these books into the stratosphere, right? Where even though I wouldn't read these books, even though I wouldn't normally read anything like this, I know about it. I know the ins and outs. I know the story. Why? Why is this renting space in my head for free?
I mean, 50 Shades of Grey is a very interesting. It started off as fan fiction of Twilight, but the interesting thing is, it focused on this relationship between Christian Grey, the billionaire, and Anastasia Steele, who is this innocent girl. She didn't even own a computer, and he's obsessed with her. And that, in romance novels, having a male character who's obsessed with the female character is something that female readers love to read about, because I think obviously it has to be a billionaire who's ridiculously handsome and good in bed, because otherwise it becomes an episode of like a crime story or something. But there's a certain, that's the element that they find sexy, not necessarily the sex scenes. It's like, this guy is completely obsessed with me to an almost unhealthy degree, and that's actually kind of hot. There's a taboo element to it. And it was the same in Twilight. This 100-year-old vampire is obsessed with the 16-year-old girl, and if you put yourself in the part of the 16-year-old girl, that's kind of hot.
Yeah, because he could have chosen anyone, but he chooses her. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Pretty much. And then Lolita. Have you ever read Lolita?
I haven't read it. Again, that's one that's so famous that I vaguely know the story.
And I had a female friend of mine who, she adored that book, and she said, I found it really hot because there's this character, Hubert, who is a really nasty piece of work, and you read the book and he's like the protagonist, but he's an absolute scumbag. And it was like, but she found it sexy reading about him being so obsessed with this girl. And it's like that obsession is something that is the female readers find really, really, really compelling. I don't think that's necessarily an element of this particular book, and I don't think when D.H. Florence wrote it, that because he's a man and he views things through sort of a male viewpoint, I don't think that's the angle he was going for. But it is interesting how it's the story and the characters that actually provide the like shock value. And then when they had the obscenity trial, I think that was in 1960, it came down to like how everyone, all these, the judge and the people trying to prosecute them knew that this book was obscene and it upset them. And then they had to sit down and try and argue why it was obscene and why it should be banned and why they should be prosecuted. And that becomes really difficult because not only is what is using a 4-letter word obscene, is describing sex obscene. Well, if it's obscene in this instance, why is it not obscene in other instances? And then it's like, if it is obscene, does it have literary merit? Because if a book can be shocking and horrifying, but if it has literary merit, maybe that justifies it. And it's such an interesting thing, because I think to a certain extent, this book deconstructed the whole idea of stuff being too obscene to let people read, because it opened up Pandora's box and made people start viewing the question themselves. And at the end of the day, it's all about, you might find it shocking, but it's all about trying to control what other people can read. And when you start, that's always like a losing strategy. I think when you try and censor things, it just makes people more interested to read it. And I think that's the amazing thing. This book has become such a part of public consciousness because this obscenity trial made people aware of it, and they hadn't been before. If they hadn't sued Penguin House and described this book as obscene, it might have just been, a steamy novel that disappeared into nowhere. But instead, it became part of the national conversation in the 1960s, and people became obsessed with it. And how many adaptations have there been? I mean, there was tons of them. There was a movie in the 70s. Was it? I don't know. There was some chap who was famous for doing steamy novels. He did one of the steamy films, and he did one in the 70s. In the 90s, I remember Sean Bean played the gardener, and there was Natalie Richardson. And I remember as a teenage boy, like staying up and watching that, being like, "Oh, look at this! I know all about this. This is steamy." And then being like, "When did they get to the sex part? Was that it? Was that it?" That was quite disappointing, actually.
The anticipation exceeds the event, huh?
Yeah, and then you just chatted to the costume designer of the new version they're having on Netflix.
Yes,
which is kind of exciting.
yes, that's right. And it's now I think it might now be the #1 thing trending on Netflix. Yes, there's obviously still this huge market for the OG, Lady Chatterley's lover. Although I keep saying it, Lady Chatterley's lover. Sorry, I keep mispronouncing it.
I find it so funny because there are so many, like the whole idea of like the cuckold erotic story is so ubiquitous in the steamy circles, and yet so many of the elements are directly lifted from Lady Chatterley's lover, and I think it was one of the original ones. The whole idea of Constance's husband being in a wheelchair from World War I, and therefore he's impotent. I mean, that's one of the elements that in all of these erotic stories that's so popular. And the gardener being working class, there's that taboo element, and that's something that all of these erotic stories lean into. And she's frustrated and curious and young and inexperienced, and she's becoming a woman in the hands of this gardener. That's something else that all of these erotic stories tend to go at. So I find it so interesting that it kind of like paved the way and became incredibly influential. And you look back at it and it might seem not as shocking as you expect it to be, but in its way, the wake of it had a huge impact on the cultural conversation around sex and infidelity.
That's what I'm wondering.
And obscenity.
I'm wondering, because does that prove the judge was right? He allowed this one book, and now it's all over the place. There's a whole genre.
Yeah. But the irony is it became that way because of the trial. And, if you don't pay attention to something, it just disappears into the ether and nobody even looks at it.
It does happen. Books they try to ban.
Yeah. I quite like reading books from that period. I remember reading Anise Nin. She wrote a lot of erotica around the 30s, I think, when she's living in Paris. And there was Henry Miller, who wrote Tropic of Cancer, and all these other authors who wrote shocking stuff. But because they weren't put on trial for it, that's become the dominion of nerdy francophiles like me. Whereas Lady Chatterley's lover became a huge national conversation. Wow. And it's interesting, the French really didn't bat an eyelid towards this, whereas the British were clutching their pearls.
The French had a very different regulatory environment, right? They didn't try and ban this kind of thing.
Yeah, I always find it so funny, having spent such a lot of time in France. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll see bare-breasted cabaret women on the television. and they'll have shampoo commercials for topless women, and they'll censor all the violence. Whereas in America, literally 8 o'clock in the morning, you'll switch on the TV and they'll have like a Freddy versus Jason movie on with all the blood and stuff, but they wouldn't dare show a nipple.
Yes, yes. Even
And
the
that's
Bond
the wrong
films
way
are
round.
cut differently. Well, people enjoy one more than the other, right? So
absolutely, I'm like, I would far rather my children get exposed to nudity than violence.
yeah, it is extraordinary. Same in the Arab world, by the way. So in the Arab world, when the children are sleeping in the afternoon, so you switch on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you see some dreadful violence on TV. But all the romance stuff that gets cut.
Yeah,
you won't be offended by the kissing.
But I find it so funny because all the decisions here come from people in authority deciding what they feel comfortable with regular people seeing. And in the 60s, when this obscenity trial was going on, it was basically like, do we feel comfortable letting the great unwashed have access to a story that is so shocking? If we let the world read Lady Chatterley's Lover, then every single common gardener is going to be banging the nice bit of posh lady. Downfall of the British Empire.
They were right. Look where we are now.
Oh, I know. Look where we are. And then just 80 years later, just overnight practically, then we've got the Prince of England marrying an American.
Oh, well, let's not go there. But as I say, this book has been hugely influential. Could I ask, it has influenced you?
I think it has. Yeah, I mean, definitely. When I started writing erotic stories, I would lift a lot of that. One of the interesting things is I started reading the steamier stuff and sort of women's fiction in the 80s. I read Jilly Cooper and Jackie Collins and stuff like that. And the interesting thing was infidelity was a huge part of that. Everyone was always bed hopping. And Jilly Cooper books, you know, the female protagonist would bed hop and have affairs and stuff like that. When I got into writing romance stories and erotic stories, I actually started off including some of that because I was like, you know, oh, she's in an unhappy marriage, so she's going to have an affair with this character. And the readers hated it. They were like, oh, we don't like her as a character because she's having an affair. And I'm like, well, she's in an unhappy marriage. What do you expect? And it's like they were very prudish about that. They didn't mind all of the sexual elements, but that was an area that they became prudish about. And it's interesting to me how the modern audience in 2020 is more prudish than perhaps an audience in the 1980s would have been. And I think it's interesting to look at that particular book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. Infidelity plays such a huge part of it. And it's interesting how, yeah, people have become more accepting of the sex part of it, but the infidelity part of it, they become less accepting of.
That is interesting. I mean, there's a suggestion among some sociologists that, you know, every generation rebels against the previous. And the way that some of the young kids, the kids really going into universities now, are rebelling is by becoming super conservative because there's nowhere else to go. Yeah.
I mean, I have to be like that. I have arguments with my 14-year-old where I'm just like, lighten up, come on.
Is she super conservative?
No, but I think a little more prudish, perhaps.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, there was stuff these days. Disney. There was that film in the 80s called Splash about the mermaid. I don't know if you remember
Daryl
that.
Hannah.
That's it. Yes, and there was a scene where she runs into the water and you see her bottom, magnificent bottom. And I remember watching that in the 80s and being like, "Oh yes, I am heterosexual." But when it was on Disney Plus, they censored that, and I find it so funny that something that was acceptable in the 80s, just innocent nudity, is now, you know, considered shocking.
That is interesting. I shall have to talk to my friend who has a massive VHS collection on the basis that they can't edit that.
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the other things. It's it was the trial, the obscenity trial, as I said, was all about control. And these days, what's interesting is, used to be you got a book and you owned the book, and then you could give the book to your neighbor or your wife or your next or the vicar or something like that, because it was tangible media, which once it was in your hand, people couldn't take away. These days, what tangible media do we own? I mean, you strike me as somebody who might have a collection of DVDs or something like that. But
I would, unfortunately, multiple housings has kind of, you know, as I move country, I've lost a fair few. But I do have like physical books for sure. And I do like to have copies of things because you never know what they're going to pull these days.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, I have dozens of movies on my Amazon Prime account, but I don't own any of them. And if Amazon Prime, disappears, or and they can, we've had cases of people who published ebooks and people have bought this ebook on the Kindle system or something, and then it's been removed. Yeah. And it's like, we don't really own anything more. And then when you think of the what's so interesting about this obscenity trial in the 1960s around Lady Chatterley's Lovely was it was about what do we feel comfortable letting the great unwashed be exposed to. And now you have these corporations that literally can take things away from people or censor things. Yeah. It's like Splash as a movie now, 40 years after it's made, they are able to go in and censor it to make it more palatable for what they think is safe to expose to people. And in some ways, it's kind of disquieting about how we don't own our culture in a way that we used to.
And it begs the question, who's controlling those who control the media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything going on with Twitter and stuff like that, it does make you realize that there are people behind the scenes pulling the strings, deciding what you can and can't look at.
So one day we might not be able to read Lady Chatterley's Lover again. So yeah, she'll buy my physical copy now.
Absolutely. Is it still in copyright? I think it is still in copyright. I was quite interested to learn that D.H. Lawrence, do you know who he married? Member of the von Richthofen family.
Oh, really?
Yes, like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and his brother was also a fighter pilot. I think that's kind of interesting, and that happened before the First World War.
Ooh, I feel there should be a book in that as well. What are we talking about gardeners for?
Exactly, but it's interesting. Maybe that was another aspect of it, because maybe people, I don't know, we tend to in Britain make pass judgments about people about where they come from and stuff like that. I think that was something else with the obscenity trial. It's, I mean, who was this son of a coal miner to be setting literature ablaze with this shocking book? And maybe there was a certain snobbery about that, and that's why the whole idea of literary merit came up. I mean, if it had been someone else who'd written, if it had been Winston Churchill wrote millions and millions of words, didn't he? If he'd written, I don't know, if he'd written a story about an aristocrat bonking the gardener, maybe nobody would have batted an eyelid. But because
I would have certainly have read it.
It probably would have been quite splendid. But so, I mean, maybe that again is part of it. There are so many elements about what made it quote unquote obscene, and it's so interesting that when you really drill down into it, it's almost like the sex scenes and the bits that are supposed to be obscene are the least obscene thing about this book. It was subversive.
I feel that is a very good point to end our discussion. Roland, thank you very, very much. I feel you've given us a lot to think about.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I'm such a nerd, but this is, I love talking about stuff like this, but I find this so interesting because it really drills down into the psychology of like what people think is acceptable and how little it has to do with, what they argue is acceptable.
Yeah, I shall end it as I feel that is the perfect place. Thank you very, very much for joining me. It's a great pleasure to have you on again.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Okay, before I sign out, I'd just like to say one last time, thank you so much to Roland for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it. And if you see the new adaptation of Lady Chatterley's Lover on Netflix, do check out the latest episode of From Tailors with Love, where I interview Emma Fryer, the costume designer, and I talk about how she costumes men in general, and we also talk about her work on the Ian Fleming Bondmaker TV movie and a little film called Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which she also worked on.